Facts of history have a way of fading and altering over time. What we think we know about the past may or may not be accurate. People and places and their significance can be forgotten as well. Join me, historian Melinda Holloway, as we dig beneath the surface of our understanding of the past and maybe even discover some new facts along the way on Uncovering History with Melinda. The American Civil War was the most brutal, destructive, and traumatic experience in the life of the United States. Neither the northern states nor the southern states could have envisioned the scope or the horror of the conflict that began in 1861. Brothers opposed brothers, fathers and sons turned against one another. Cities were ravaged, and vast tracts of once productive soil were laid waste by the indiscriminate destruction of opposing armies. An average of 430 soldiers died each day of the 4-year war. An entire generation of Americans was annihilated on the battlefield. How could such great division in this relatively young nation that was founded on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness occur? This division did not happen overnight. Neither did it arise over a decade. It began almost as early as the first European settlers began arriving in America. As early as the 1500s, Africans were bought or captured by the Portuguese and other Europeans and sold as slaves. So when people from Europe began settling America in the early 1600s, the Portuguese saw a new opportunity to sell more African slaves to the colonists in America. Slavery at the beginning of colonization consisted of European indentured servants and Africans who were captured and sold. But most of the early African slaves were treated as indentured servants as well. They would serve for a number of years and then gain their freedom. Things began to change around 1640. The African status in America deteriorated as its colonies slowly added laws to permit slavery and restrict the rights of Africans. One is the story of John Punch, a black indentured servant who ran away from his boss, along with 2 white indentured servants, in 1640. All were captured. While the white indentured servants had their terms extended by 4 years each, Punch had his term of service extended to the rest of his life. The second example is the case of John Casor in 1654. He was also an indentured servant who left his boss. In this case, his boss was Anthony Johnson, who had been one of the first Africans brought to the colonies and had earned his freedom and bought his own piece of land. Johnson found Casor and brought him to court to force him back into servitude. Casor claimed that he had earned his freedom, but the court did not agree. It went a step further and declared that Casor would be Johnson's property for the rest of his life. These decisions laid the legal foundation for lifetime servitude. More laws followed, including one in 1662 that said children were born into slavery if their mothers were enslaved. Another law in 1705 declared all non-Christian servants that were brought to the colonies would automatically be enslaved. Over the coming years, 2 opposing ideas about slavery would develop and drive a wedge between the colonies. One idea was held by abolitionists, which assumed that black people were equal to white people and deserved the same rights and freedoms as whites. The other line of thought was pro-slavery, or anti-abolitionist, which held that black people were property and were to be used in the service of superior whites. By 1776, slavery was practiced in every colony, but it had decreased in the northern colonies and increased in the south. Northern shipping merchants still remained dependent on the trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas that included the traffic of enslaved peoples. Southern farms and plantations needed cheap labor to produce tobacco, cotton, and other cash crops for export back to Europe. In his initial draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson blamed Britain's King George for his role in creating and perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade, which Jefferson described as a crime against humanity. He further criticized the British Crown for, quote, exciting those very people to rise in arms against us, unquote. But for the Founding Fathers, to call slavery a cruel war against human nature itself may have accurately reflected the values of many of the founders, but it also underscored the paradox between what they said and what they did. 1/3 of the Declaration of Independence signers were enslavers. Even some of those who owned slaves knew that the institution should not continue. But most slave-owning signers had no plan to try and abolish slavery. And in those colonies, they were not willing to compromise their way of life in order to pursue independence. So in the end, all references to slavery were removed from the Declaration of Independence in order to present a unanimous declaration to the king. But that meant that the debate about what to do with the slavery question would have to wait for another time. The Founding Fathers missed an opportunity to end slavery in America. As the status quo continued regarding the issue of slavery in America, a very important machine was invented that would dramatically increase the demand for slaves. In 1793, just 17 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Before this invention was implemented, an enslaved cotton picker could be expected to remove the seeds from approximately 1 pound of cotton each day. With the use of the cotton gin, seeds could be removed from 50 pounds of cotton each day. While it was true that the cotton gin reduced the labor of removing seeds, it did not reduce the need for slaves to grow and pick cotton. Growing cotton became so profitable for the planters that it increased the demand for both land and slave labor. The desire for more land encouraged westward migration to new areas of the South. In 1790, right before the invention of the cotton gin, the number of enslaved people was 700,000. By 1850, that number had risen to over 3 million. As the nation expanded west, there arose the question of whether new states would be slave or free. In 1820, an attempt at a compromise regarding slavery was enacted by the federal government. The Missouri Compromise stopped Northern attempts to forever prohibit slavery expansion to the new states by admitting a slave state and a free state in exchange for allowing no new slave state north of the 3630 parallel. Missouri was the only exception. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 gave the country a new status quo that lasted until something violated the uneasy peace. A series of events in what is now Texas would cause a major disruption to upset the status quo. Planters and other settlers who had been moving to the Mexican territory of Texas in search of more land to grow cotton desired to be free of Mexican rule. In 1836, they rebelled and fought against the Mexican army, defeating them at the Battle of San Jacinto. Claiming independence from Mexico, the victors declared themselves the new Republic of Texas. They ruled themselves for 9 years before requesting annexation by the United States. Texas became the 28th state in 1846. This annexation caused political relations with Mexico to deteriorate, so much so that America went to war with Mexico that same year. After 2 years of war, the Mexicans were defeated. In response to their loss, through the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded a large amount of land to the United States. While the war with Mexico was being fought, a new invention was being used on sugarcane plantations in Louisiana that revolutionized the processing of sugar. Just as the invention of the cotton gin had increased the demand for more land and slaves, the vacuum evaporator for sugar had the same effect. This new invention, combined with the addition of all of the new land gained from Mexico, caused much debate regarding the future of slavery. These pressed the question of how to treat all of this new land. Would it be slave or free? By 1850, another government compromise was needed to calm the division increasing among the citizens of the United States. The solution adopted by Congress was a group of 5 separate bills that became known as the Compromise of 1850. One bill stated that a considerable part of the territory claimed by Texas was to be transferred to the federal government. Another bill called for the organization of 2 new territories within the land that would be transferred to the federal government: the Territory of New Mexico and the Territory of Utah. These new territories would be allowed to determine whether they would become slave or free. 2 more bills would add another free state to the Union, that of California, and the other would abolish the slave trade in Washington, the District of Columbia. The final bill was the most controversial. A measure would be adopted to recover slaves who had escaped to a free state or free territory. This became known as the Fugitive Slave Act. The act also made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying escaped slaves. Among the debates and political compromises came a surprising flashpoint of controversy. In 1852, while in the midst of the most recent compromise, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a Christian abolitionist, published a fictional anti-slavery novel. The book Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 10,000 copies in its first week and 300,000 copies in the first year. It had a profound effect on attitudes towards African Americans and the institution of slavery in the United States. The publication and sale of this book are said to have helped lay the groundwork for the Civil War. In 1854, a new law nullified the old 1820 Missouri Compromise that had ruled out slavery north of the 3630 parallel. This new law stated that the newest territories of Kansas and Nebraska would be allowed to choose whether or not they wanted slavery in their territories. This angered abolitionists and led to violence in Kansas where people fought and killed each other over the issue of slavery. Earlier in the 1830s, the slave of an army surgeon was taken with his master from Missouri to army posts in Illinois and what is now Minnesota. Since Illinois and Minnesota were free according to the 1820 Missouri Compromise, the slave named Dred Scott sued for his freedom once he arrived back in Missouri, on the grounds that he had lived in a free land for an extended period of time and that he should be considered free. Dred Scott's case took 11 years to argue through the courts. By 1857, his case had made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But the court would rule against Dred Scott, stating that his time in free states and territories did not make him free once he returned to Missouri. The court also emphasized that as an enslaved man, he was not a citizen but another person's property. This decision drove the wedge deeper into the country's already divided society. The Dred Scott decision was another step on the road to civil war. John Brown was a minister and a radical abolitionist who believed that the only way to overthrow the institution of slavery in the United States was by an armed insurrection. He had already been in Kansas during the bloody violence there. Now he was seeking the help of former slave and well-known abolitionist Frederick Douglass. They were friends in their agreement on the abolition of slavery. Frederick Douglass supported Brown's mission, though he did not always agree with Brown's tactics. John Brown decided that he was going to secretly collect guns and pikes to make a raid on the United States Arsenal and Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown would use the confiscated weapons to arm slaves that he hoped would then rise up and fight against their captors. In the weeks before the Harper's Ferry raid, Brown met Frederick Douglass, requesting that Douglass join the raid. "Come with me, Douglass. I will defend you with my life. When I strike, the bees will begin to swarm, and I shall want you to help hive them." Douglass declined, advising that an attack against the federal government would turn public opinion against abolitionists. The raid began on October 16, 1859, as Brown led 18 men, 13 whites and 5 blacks, into Harper's Ferry, where they captured federal government buildings and cut telegraph wires. They killed 4 people and wounded 9. Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry ultimately failed, and the state of Virginia tried and hanged him. On December 2, 1859, crowds gathered in Charlestown, Virginia to witness the hanging of John Brown. He wrote this message on a piece of paper and gave it to his jailer. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. The pivotal issues of the upcoming 1860 presidential election were how to handle slavery as the country expands into new territories, and whether the federal government or state governments had the ultimate power to decide issues in individual states. There were 4 candidates that held differing views on these issues: Republican Abraham Lincoln, Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas, Southern Democrat John Breckinridge, and third-party candidate Constitutional Unionist John Bell. There were 2 Democratic candidates because the Democratic Party had split into Northern and Southern factions over disagreements about slavery. Abraham Lincoln wanted to prohibit slavery in new territories and to contain it where it existed. Stephen Douglas was ambivalent about slavery and supported new territories forming. He also supported states and territories to decide for themselves whether they wanted to be slave or free. John Breckinridge supported slavery and believed that the federal government was not to restrict slavery anywhere. He also wanted each state and territory to have the ultimate ability to decide for themselves whether they wanted to have slavery in their state or not. John Bell wanted to avoid the slavery issue altogether and keep the country united. The issue of slavery had grown so volatile by the time of this election that Southern states threatened to secede from the Union if a Republican were elected president. And on Election Day, November 6, 1860, that is exactly what happened. Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. He won 18 states in the North, plus the 2 western states of California and Oregon, with 40% of the national vote. Not one vote was cast for him in the South. It has been said by some sources that the reason there were no votes for him in the South is because Abraham Lincoln was not on the ballot in Southern states. That would be incorrect. Elections before the 20th century had straight ticket ballots for an entire party's candidates. Voting was not a private event. A person submitted a party's ballot in front of election officials and dropped it into a box. Pressure to vote with the majority opinion in your county or parish would have been very strong during this election. Voting in opposition to the majority of your community could have been dangerous to your life and property. Political parties were responsible to disseminate their ballots to all polling places before the election, but the Republican Party did not believe it would be worth delivering ballots to states in the South. Plus, the Republican Party knew they didn't need the electoral votes from the Southern states to win the election. Within the first 6 weeks after the presidential election, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union on December 20, 1860. By February 1st, 6 more states had seceded, those of Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states, except Texas, met in Montgomery, Alabama on February 4th to form a new government. They elected former Senator Jefferson Davis to be the President of the Confederate States of America. The Constitution makes no provision for secession. It never assumed that a state would want to secede from the Union. But it does not follow that because a state cannot secede constitutionally, that it is obligated, under all circumstances, to remain in the Union. The new president felt it was his sacred duty to preserve the Union at all costs. His first inaugural address was an appeal to rebellious states to rejoin the Union. 7 states had seceded by the time of his inauguration on March 4, 1861. Confederate states had begun planning to take over federal installations and coastal forts. The first place where a battle ensued between the Confederate and United States forces was at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, on April 12, 1861. And thus began the American Civil War.